We often hear about the U.S. legal system, being this gold standard, a shield against injustice.
Right.
But what happens when it runs up against something like immigration deportation? It gets intense.
Yeah, definitely.
We've seen some serious clashes lately between policy and these basic legal ideas. Makes you wonder about due process, for everyone here.
Absolutely. And some recent cases, high-profile ones, and just the general conversation nationally, it's really shown a light on how complex and sometimes, frankly, how fragile the deportation process can be. So for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a bit. News reports on specific legal fights, expert analysis, even a peek into online forums where people share their real anxieties.
Okay, so our goal today is to try and wade through all that complexity, pull out what really matters,
Exactly.
get past the legal speak, understand the core issues, because this isn't just about immigration status, is it?
Not at all. It really hits at the foundation of government power, the rights everyone physically present in the U.S. is supposed to have, citizen or not.
Right. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got our expert here for that crucial analysis and, the bigger picture.
Happy to be here. So maybe we should start with a really fundamental concept. Judicial review, especially how it works with immigration decisions.
Okay, sounds good. So, judicial review. In simple terms, what are we talking about when it comes to immigration?
Okay, put simply, judicial review is the power federal courts have to look at decisions made by immigration agencies.
Like ICE or USCIS?
Exactly. Could be reviewing why a visa was denied or looking closely at a final order of removal, the order to deport someone.
Okay.
The key thing here is that even government agencies dealing with immigration, they aren't above the law. Judicial review is supposed to be the check on that.
And why is that check so important? Specifically for immigration cases, what's really at stake?
Well, it's critical for a few big reasons. First, it's oversight for the executive branch, making sure they're applying immigration laws correctly. And think about the sheer number of cases they handle every year. Resources are stretched thin. Mistakes are, almost bound to happen.
Right.
So judicial review gives people a way to catch and fix those errors.
Which makes total sense,
Yeah.
especially given the consequences. Deportation isn't just paperwork. It's life-changing for people, for families.
Exactly. A denial, a removal order that can split families apart. It can send someone back to real danger. Plus, something like half of all immigrants in removal proceedings, they don't have lawyers.
Wow, half.
Yeah. So in those situations, judicial review becomes an even more vital safety net. It's about making the process fairer, building confidence that the system is, basically accurate and just.
But getting a court to actually review an immigration decision, it's not automatic, is it? Our sources mention some real roadblocks.
That's a really important point. Yeah. Even though it's crucial, actually getting into federal court to appeal, often incredibly hard.
How so?
Well, for one, there's a super strict 30-day deadline to appeal a removal order.
30 days. That's it.
That's it. And usually no exceptions. The clock starts the moment the order is issued, which, if you don't get the notice right away, especially if you're in detention.
Yeah, that seems incredibly tight.
Yeah.
Barely time to understand what happened, let alone find a lawyer and file something solid.
Precisely. And then Congress has also put limits on what kinds of arguments the courts can even hear.
Like what?
Often, courts are barred from reviewing what they call discretionary decisions.
Discretionary, meaning?
Like an immigration judge's call on whether they believe someone's testimony, that kind of judgment call. Often shielded from review. There are also limits on reviewing certain asylum eligibility details, challenges to those quick expedited removal orders at the border, and findings of fact about past crimes.
So even if you genuinely think a major legal error was made, some doors to appeal are just closed.
In a lot of cases, yeah, that's the reality. And then you have the practical stuff. Trying to appeal from outside the U.S., extremely difficult without a lawyer, navigating this complex system from abroad. Plus, and this is big filing an appeal, doesn't automatically stop the deportation.
Wait, really? They can deport you while your appeal is pending?
They can, sometimes even before that 30-day appeal window closes.
Wow, okay. It paints a picture where, even with the idea of fairness, the system itself throws up some pretty serious obstacles.
They definitely can.
So let's maybe look at a specific case that brings some of these issues out. The case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Yeah, this one it's quite something. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's from El Salvador, has a wife and kids who are U.S. citizens. And back in 2019, he was actually granted withholding of removal.
Withholding of removal. Explain that quickly.
Think of it like a legal shield. It means it was legally recognized that sending him back to El Salvador would be too dangerous for him. So he was protected from deportation to El Salvador.
Okay, so he had this legal protection. What went wrong? How did he end up deported?
Well, in March 2025, because of what the government itself called an administrative error, a clear mistake, he was deported to El Salvador.
No.
And incredibly, sent to the same prison in El Salvador that holds alleged gang members. The very danger he was supposed to be protected from.
That's unbelievable. Just a nightmare scenario for him. What was the court's reaction to this mistake?
Judge Paula Shinas, she's a federal judge in Maryland, she issued a really, really strong criticism of what the government did.
Strong how?
She called the deportation an illegal act, an unconstitutional seizure, said there was no warrant, no probable cause for the detention that led to it, and based on that, she ordered the government bring him back.
Okay, so the court orders his return to fix the government's own mistake, but the Justice Department, they didn't just say, okay, our bad, did they? They pushed back.
They did. They fought his return. Their argument was basically twofold. First, they claimed he was an MS-13 gang member, a public safety threat. Second, they argued that once he was deported, in El Salvador's custody, U.S. courts just didn't have the legal power anymore to order him brought back.
And what did Judge Sinas think about those arguments, especially the gang stuff?
She was very skeptical. Very. Particularly about the gang claims. She called the evidence they presented, which apparently included things like Chicago Bulls hat, a hoodie, and a tip from an informant who got info from a place Abrego Garcia never even lived. She called it just chatter.
Just chatter, wow.
Yeah. She basically said the government hadn't shown credible evidence in court to back up those serious accusations.
Sounds like the judge was really focused on needing actual proof, due process. Evidence.
Exactly. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court stepped in. They issued a pretty significant order telling the government to actively facilitate his return.
Facilitate. So help make it happen.
Right. And to treat his case legally as if the deportation never happened. They even explicitly called the deportation illegal.
That's a very clear statement from the highest court.
It really is. It underlines how serious the government's mistake was and how fundamental due process is, even in immigration cases. There was also a comment from an appeals court judge, J. Harvey Wilkinson, on this.
Oh, yeah. What did he say?
He said, the government asserts that Abrego Garcia is a terrorist and a member of MS-13. Perhaps, but perhaps not. Regardless, he is still entitled to due process.
That really cuts to the heart of it, doesn't it? It's about the right to a fair process, whatever the accusations are.
Precisely.
Now, this case, Abrego Garcia's, it feels like maybe it's not totally unique. Are we seeing other challenges around deportations, maybe to what they call third countries?
That's right. The Abrego Garcia situation, it fits into a wider pattern. We're seeing more legal challenges about deporting immigrants, including some with criminal records, to third countries, meaning not their home country.
Okay.
And these challenges almost always come back to due process concerns.
Like that situation with Judge Brian Murphy and the plane heading to South Sudan with convicted immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. Judge Murphy was actually thinking about ordering a plane to turn around. It was carrying 8 people convicted of some pretty serious crimes: murder, robbery, sexual assault, DUI, things like that.
Okay.
The issue was their home countries, Laos, Mexico, Burma, Vietnam, South Sudan itself for some, wouldn't take them back. So the plan was to send them to South Sudan.
And the legal argument against that?
The argument was that sending them to South Sudan violated an earlier order Judge Murphy himself had made.
What did that order say?
It said migrants had to be given a meaningful opportunity to show that being sent to a specific third country would be dangerous for them. He'd previously blocked deportations to Libya on similar grounds, not enough notice, no real chance to argue was unsafe.
So the claim was these 8 individuals weren't given that meaningful opportunity regarding South Sudan specifically.
Exactly. But the executive branch really pushed back hard on the judge getting involved. Assistant Secretary McLaughlin said it was, quote, absurd for a district judge to try to dictate the foreign policy and national security.
Right. There's that tension again. Executive versus judicial power in immigration. And then there was that really intense situation with Judge James Boasberg over Venezuelan migrants being sent to El Salvador.
Yes, that got very heated. Judge Boasberg actually threatened the Trump administration with criminal contempt charges.
Contempt. Wow. Why?
He felt they deliberately ignored his order to return a group of Venezuelan migrants who were on a plane heading to this high-security prison in El Salvador, CECOT. They were being sent under something called the Alien Enemies Act.
And this group being sent to El Salvador, what was their situation?
Well, reports suggested maybe 22% had some kind of criminal record, but the vast majority, like 75%, apparently did not. Judge Boasberg accused the administration of having deliberately flouted his orders, showing willful disregard because they didn't turn the plane around like he'd instructed. He even talked about holding hearings, pursuing charges, maybe even appointing a private lawyer to prosecute if the Justice Department wouldn't.
That's pretty extreme for a judge to consider. How did that standoff end?
Ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned Boasberg's order to return the migrants. But, and this is key, they did it based on jurisdiction, the court's authority in that specific situation, not on the underlying due process issue Boasberg was raising.
So the core principle was kind of left hanging.
In that specific ruling, yes. And Judge Boasberg definitely kept voicing his concerns about the administration's actions and the due process principle itself.
And El Salvador keeps popping up here. There was another judge, Stephanie Gallagher, involved with El Salvador too, right?
Yes. Judge Gallagher also had strong words for the administration. This time, it was about resisting the return of a Venezuelan man who'd been wrongly deported to El Salvador.
Wrongly deported? How?
This man had a legal settlement agreement. It specifically said he couldn't be deported while his asylum case was still pending.
Okay, so clear legal protection.
Clear legal protection. But he was deported to El Salvador anyway. And the administration argued there was no point bringing him back because, they claimed, his asylum case was going to be denied eventually.
And Judge Gallagher's reaction to that argument, let's just skip to the end.
Pretty much the opposite. She said very directly, process is important, we don't skip to the end. Her point was, even if you think you know the outcome, the person is still entitled to go through the proper legal steps, due process.
So across these different judges, different cases, we're seeing this consistent pushback on third country deportations.
Yeah.
What's the core constitutional issue they keep pointing to?
It really centers on the Fifth Amendment, the part that guarantees due process of law. And critically, it says persons, not citizens.
Right, persons.
So judges are saying sending people to third countries without proper notice, without a real chance to argue it's dangerous for them there, without any meaningful legal recourse, that violates this fundamental right. Judge Brian Murphy in Massachusetts, he seemed pretty shocked by the government's stance. He basically said the idea that you could send someone to any country with just vague promises they won't be tortured. He said that goes against what the Supreme Court has said, what Congress intended, common sense, basic decency, and his own court's rulings. Pretty strong language.
Yeah, it sounds like a major disagreement on how to read some fundamental legal ideas. How did the Trump administration generally respond to these kinds of challenges from judges?
Broadly speaking, they tended to view these judicial concerns as overwrought and unrealistic.
Overwrought.
Yeah. They consistently pointed to what they saw as their election mandate to be tough on immigration, enforce the laws, carry out deportations. A White House spokesperson, Kush Desai, said the administration would use every power endowed to the executive branch to do that.
And some officials used even stronger language about the judges, didn't they?
Oh, definitely. Stephen Miller, who was a key architect of immigration policy, he actually called these rulings upholding due process rights a judicial coup. A coup against the executive branch.
That was his framing, yeah. A coup against their authority to enforce immigration law. He even mentioned they were actively looking at potentially suspending habeas corpus.
Suspending habeas corpus, that's huge. The right to challenge unlawful detention.
Exactly. It's a cornerstone legal principle.
Yeah.
So suggesting suspending it, even just looking at it, was a pretty radical statement.
And President Trump himself weighed in on this, too, on due process.
He did. He publicly questioned whether the Constitution's due process requirements should really apply to non-citizens at all. He often expressed frustration with courts for, as he saw it, delaying deportations of people he called murderers and other criminals. And DHS spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin echoed that, questioning why invading aliens or people who broke laws should get constitutional protection in the first place.
It's such a stark difference from the judges focusing on that word person in the Fifth Amendment.
A very stark difference. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. All these legal fights, policy arguments, what's the impact on actual people? We looked at some online discussions, right, from that Reddit immigration thread.
Yeah, and that Reddit thread gives you a really raw, unfiltered look at the anxiety these big debates cause on the ground.
How so?
Well, there was one user, Bella Mariup, who posted about being terrified of getting arrested and deported at her upcoming removal hearing.
Okay.
And this was even though she's married to a U.S. citizen, hadn't had any trouble since a past DUI, and had even applied for a green card. Just sheer fear about showing up to court.
That sounds incredibly stressful. What kind of feedback did she get from others on Reddit?
The responses were mostly really cautious, some pretty alarming. Several people, including someone who said they used to be a deportation officer, told her, yeah, it was definitely possible ICE could detain her right there at the courthouse.
Wow. So going to your required court date could mean getting detained.
That was the fear, yeah. The advice people gave ranged from, practical stuff like get your affairs in order just in case, to even considering leaving the country voluntarily, self-deporting to avoid detention.
That really shows the level of fear out there. Did anyone offer more concrete, legal suggestions?
Oh, yes. The number one piece of advice, repeated over and over, was get a lawyer. Immediately.
Right.
People talked about possible ways to fight removal, like something called cancellation of removal. But that has tough requirements, like needing 10 years of continuous presence in the U.S. The whole conversation just highlighted this feeling of increased risk, increased fear of detention and deportation right now.
It really connects the dots, doesn't it? Between these complex court cases and the very real fear and potentially devastating outcomes for individuals just trying to navigate the system.
Absolutely.
Okay, one last specific legal thing to touch on briefly. Judicial deportation. What is that and how does it fit in?
Right. Judicial deportation. It's a specific process set up back in 1994. It basically lets a U.S. district court judge, a federal judge handling criminal cases, order a non-citizen deported at the same time they're being sentenced for a crime.
Okay, but only for certain crimes.
Yes, only for crimes that make someone deportable under immigration law. Usually things like crimes involving moral turpitude or what the law calls aggravated felonies. And it's worth noting, the legal definition of aggravated felony is much broader than what you might normally think of as an aggravated crime.
So it combines the criminal sentence and the deportation order into one step in some cases?
Sort of, yeah. But there are strict rules. The U.S. attorney handling the criminal case has to ask for it, and they need the okay from INS, well, now DHS, before the trial or guilty plea even happens.
Okay.
And the defendant and immigration authorities have to be formally notified. There needs to be a specific charging document filed at least 30 days before sentencing, again with DHS signing off. So lots of procedural hoops.
And does due process still apply here, even though it's happening alongside a criminal sentencing?
Absolutely. That fundamental right to due process extends to these judicial deportation proceedings, too. The person still has the right to a fair hearing on the deportation issue, the right to a lawyer, all those core protections.
So even in this maybe more streamlined process,
Yeah.
the system still demands that fairness, that due process.
There's a requirement, yeah.
Okay. This has been really insightful.
Yeah.
Digging into this whole complicated, often really fraught issue of deportation, especially that tension, right, between the executive branch wanting to enforce laws and the courts trying to protect rights.
Definitely. And we've seen how central due process is to all these fights. Cases like Abrego Garcia's really highlight what can go wrong. And these challenges over third country deportations, they push the boundaries. And remembering those barriers to getting judicial review in the first place, it shows how tough it can be for individuals to even have their case heard. Then you hear the anxieties from people online, and it brings the human cost right into focus.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. What does this constant argument over due process and deportation really tell us about our core legal values in the U.S.? Who actually gets the full protection of the system? And looking ahead, how might the way these legal battles turn out actually reshape immigration enforcement and maybe even that delicate balance of power between the branches of government?